Okay, welcome everybody. So glad that you could join us this morning to join us for this webinar, Sleep and Mental Health, How to Rest and Perform at Your Best. I'm sure we can all relate that in today's fast-paced work environment, sleep can sometimes be sacrificed in the name of productivity. But what if improving your sleep could actually help you be more productive and focused and resilient at work? And that's what we're here to explore today. I'd also love to hear your questions. We're going to go through the questions at the end of the webinar, but feel free to pop them in the chat box as we go along. So my name's Ellice and I'm a business psychologist specialising in workplace wellbeing, mental health and leadership development. I work with organisations to help people thrive at work because when people are healthy, engaged and well rested, businesses perform better. And I think sleep is one of the most underrated factors in workplace performance. So I'm really excited to be delivering this webinar with the fantastic Dr. David Garley from the Better Sleep Clinic. So Dave, thank you for being here. Before we dive into today's discussion, could you briefly introduce yourself and tell us more about the Better Sleep Clinic?
Of course, yes. Thank you, Ellice, and thanks for having me on this webinar. It's a great opportunity to talk about sleep and mental health. So, my name's David. I'm a medical doctor. I'm director of the Better Sleep Clinic. So, we work with clients on a one-to-one basis with a variety of different sleep disorders, things like insomnia, sleep apnea, and various other conditions. But we also work with organisations, both within the workplace and within high performance sport and other settings. And really, this is about sleep and its role in mental health, general health, and productivity and performance. So this is something that's so important for everybody. So we're really happy to be able to have these different settings that we work with, and we're going to chat about various aspects of sleep today and how it can affect your mental health, but also your performance at work.
Fantastic, thank you. So here's what to expect in today's session. First, Dave will talk us through some basic sleep science, why we sleep, what happens when we don't, and how sleep affects overall health and performance. Then I'll be talking about the relationship between our sleep and our mental health, particularly exploring how stress, anxiety, and thought patterns interrupt our sleep and what we can do about it. And finally, together we'll wrap up with some practical sleep strategies and cognitive techniques to help improve your sleep and performance at work before opening the floor to your questions. So without further ado, over to you, Dave.
Thanks. So a sensible place to start is the question, why do we sleep? But it's an odd question because we're not entirely sure, or not entirely, because sleep's actually a really difficult thing to research. Partly because when you're studying someone who's sleeping, is that they are actually asleep, so they're very difficult to communicate with. So what you're left with is this idea of researching sleep just half a step behind. So what we tend to do is look at large groups of people who don't sleep well and see what happens to them. And actually, there's no body system that escapes unscathed from poor sleep, but the system probably most affected is the brain, which makes us think that sleep is primarily a neurological function. But there are other functions to sleep. So physical rest and recuperation, I think most of us can probably identify with this. If you haven't slept, you do feel quite physically fatigued. And sometimes this actually relates to things like growth hormone. So growth hormone is a really important hormone that we produce for growth and repair, which is released almost exclusively in sleep. And so if you're missing out on sleep, you miss out on growth and repair. So restoration of our immune system is also a role of sleep. So large parts of our immune system are actually protein-based in the form of antibodies, and these are regenerated while we sleep. And so again, if you miss out on sleep, then your immune system can take a pang if you are quite sleep deprived. Some people will mention that they do actually get a cold more often. So that's usually what's going on there. Memory formation is a really important function. So when you take your memories from short term to long term, this is a process called memory consolidation. And this happens a lot more in sleep. And there's been a lot of studies that have shown even things like your ability to remember a list. If you have a long period in between, if you're allowed to sleep in between, then your recall is much better. And actually that's for all kinds of memory. So not just list learning, but also things like muscle memory. Emotional regulation. again, a lot of people will probably identify with this. If you are sleep deprived, that you can be a bit more cranky. And this actually relates to a particular state of sleep called REM, which some of you may have heard of. And then this last one here, clearing out a brain waste product. So your brain needs a bit of maintenance, and this happens a lot more as you're sleeping. In terms of why sleep's important, I think today with all of the content and information about healthcare, it can be quite difficult to navigate your way through. So we find it's quite useful if you actually just hack it right back to its bare bones. What you're left with is this thing called the 3 pillars of health, or the pyramid of health. It's absolutely basic. So, and this consists of exercise, nutrition, and sleep. And often, if you're not where you want to be with your health, it's quite easy to gravitate towards things like exercise and nutrition, because you feel that you can kind of do something about these. That exercise and nutrition are quite solid concepts, and sleep's perhaps not quite so straightforward. But the key point here is that neither of these are more important than the other. It's about all 3 of these being addressed. And so, if you're not where you want to be with your health, it's important to focus on all 3 areas. And obviously, today we're going to focus on the role of sleep. More specifically, how sleep can impact your health. You actually only have to think back to the last time that you didn't sleep well and how you felt. And you probably felt pretty awful. You felt physically fatigued, you couldn't concentrate, you couldn't remember anything, and you were probably quite cranky. And this is after one night of sleep. But if you didn't sleep well for a week or a month or a year, actually the impact on your health can be a bit more sinister. And there's actually very good research that links poor sleep to a really wide variety of different health problems. So cardiovascular disease, this is our arteries, they fur up. That's a natural process, but it is more accelerated if you habitually poor sleep. And part of that is, if you think about sleep, your heart rate's lower, your blood pressure is lower. It's a state of relative cardiovascular relaxation. And so if we sleep for roughly 8 hours, which means we roughly sleep for about a third of our lives. If you're habitually poor sleeping, short sleeping, that you're spending a lot more time in this more stressed cardiovascular state, which probably explains why people who habitually poor sleep, have things like high blood pressure, heart attacks, strokes, and things like that, sometimes at an earlier age than they would do otherwise. Diabetes, so there are research that shows that that poor sleep should be seen alongside other more traditional risk factors for type 2 diabetes, such as carrying extra weight. Mental health is an area that is really well researched in sleep, and the term that you come across is the bi-directional relationship between sleep and mental health. So we've known for years that certain mental health conditions, such as depression and anxiety, can disrupt your sleep. So anxiety can make it quite difficult to fall asleep, and depression famously causes early morning wakening, not all the time, but it can do. But the research shows it actually works the other way around as well, and poor sleep actually causes depression and causes anxiety. And when poor sleep is both a cause and an effect of a mental health condition, that it means that as a system they can feed into each other, and you can end up in these rapidly escalating situations where both your sleep and your mental health are getting worse. And when that happens, the best thing to do is actually to focus on sleep and mental health to actually address both things. Workplace safety, so lots of research about how your risk of an accident goes up if you're underslept. And that's not just at the workplace, but also commuting to the workplace, which brings us on to the next point, which is road traffic accidents. So roughly 20%, so 1 in 5 car crashes is related to poor sleep, which I think is a really challenging statistic, I think. And when you look at these 5 points, what strikes me is that there really is no part of your life that is not affected by poor sleep. It's absolutely essential.
And if you think about it in terms of the workplace, it directly affects how we work, how you interact with colleagues, even how safe we are on the job, which Dave has already alluded to. You see when people are experiencing poor sleep in the workplace, there are instances of increased presenteeism. So you're working whilst you're unwell or you're exhausted. And I'm sure we can relate that you might be physically at work, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're fully functioning. And our sleep deprivation often leads to things like slower reaction times, difficulty concentrating, and it affects our decision making. And research shows that employees who don't sleep well experience up to 50% more productivity loss compared to well-rested employees. It also affects safety issues and workplace accidents, which Dave has already started to explain. One of the biggest concerns with sleep deprivation is safety. And we can see that sleep deprived employees are more likely to make errors and potentially have accidents. And that could be at the workplace, but even outside and just commuting. I've even seen that poor sleep can impair your reaction time as much as being legally over the alcohol limit. So it's really important for organisations with those who may be driving or commuting to take sleep into account. It also affects our absenteeism, our sick leave, and our turnover as well. It's linked to stress and burnout, and even long-term health issues like cardiovascular disease, as Dave has told us. So we can see that employees with poor sleep patterns are more likely to need sickness absences, and in extreme cases, even leave their roles due to exhaustion and poor well-being. And finally, that will affect our problem solving, creativity, and overall job performance. So if you've ever found yourself rereading an email over and over again before it makes sense because you're sleep deprived, maybe you can understand how productivity and performance has been affected by poor sleep. So what does this mean for businesses in concrete terms or financial implications? Per employee, sleep deprivation can lead to significant financial losses to organisations. And there are estimates that suggest that fatigued employees cost employers between £250 and £1,525 each year due to those factors that I've just mentioned: your productivity, your absences, your sick leave, your accidents. And understanding the profound impact of sleep on both our personal health and organisational performance is really important. Over to you, Dave.
So I'm going to talk just a bit about how sleep is controlled. It's a really interesting area. So sleep is vital. You can actually survive longer without food than you can without sleep. But unlike these other vital processes, sleep's actually outside of our voluntary control, which is quite unusual. But it gets even stranger because the more you try to sleep, the less likely it is to happen. There's a man in sleep medicine who refers to sleep as being like a dove. If you hold your arm out and don't move, the dove will come and land on your arm. But if you try and grab the dove or even just move your arm, the dove will fly away. And certainly within our clinic, a lot of the questions that we get arise out of this frustration of not being able to control sleep, that either you can't sleep at night or you can't stop sleeping during the day. So there's basically two systems that control sleep. One is this idea that the longer you're awake, the more sleepy you feel, which again, I think most people probably understand. Biochemically, what this comes back to is a chemical called adenosine. So whenever you're awake, your body produces adenosine, and the adenosine accumulates. And the more adenosine you have, the more sleepy you feel. And the only thing that can get rid of adenosine is sleep. The best way to understand it is actually, if you think back to the last time that you stayed up all night, either because you were socializing or traveling or working, but the experience is usually the same for most people, that you get to your usual bedtime and you'll feel sleepy, you'll think about your bed, you'll start yawning, but you can usually push through. Most people can make themselves stay awake if they need to. But it gets progressively more difficult as the night goes on, usually reaching a peak at about 3 or maybe 4 in the morning. People who work night shifts will usually tell you that this is the worst time to try and stay awake, that you can barely keep your eyes open, that if you're sat down, the motivation that you need to get up out of your chair is enormous, that you can't remember anything, you can't concentrate, and you feel cold. But from that point, as you go on, as you get closer to 8, 9 in the morning, you've been awake for longer, but you'll start to feel more alert. You'll start to feel more awake. So it can't just be how long you've been awake that governs how sleepy you feel. There has to be something else. And there is. And this is the second system, which is the circadian rhythm, which you might have heard about. Sometimes gets called the internal body clock. And this is something that we've evolved because as a species, we're very reliant on light to carry out our activities. That we're not a species that can sniff our way through a forest or hear very well, that we need to see. So we've evolved to be active during the daylight hours and sleep at night. And this just continues with its own internal momentum. So You could put 100 people in a cave in the dark, and they'd still intuitively know, is it day or is it night? And so these two systems, you can see how they work together with this chart. So you've got the circadian rhythm as this red line just fluctuating along the bottom. And then you've got the yellow line, which is your adenosine. So on this chart, this person's woken up at 7 a.m. And because they're awake, you can see that they're building adenosine. The more adenosine you have, the more sleepy you feel. The circadian rhythm is kicking up into its wake phase during the day, making you feel quite alert. And then it takes its downturn in the early evening, which corresponds to a high adenosine. And the distance between these two lines is quite great. So this person has a strong urge to fall asleep, which they do at 11 p.m. And you can see that because they're asleep, their adenosine drops. And they sleep during the night phase of their circadian rhythm. And circadian rhythms are very consistent in a lot of people. And it kicks up at about 7 a.m. So these are people who always wake up at the same time each morning, 2 minutes before their alarm. And because they're awake, they start building adenosine. So that's a normal day. And if you were to pull an all-nighter, this is what it would look like. So this vertical black line is your usual bedtime. The first part of the day is the same, but because you've not gone to sleep, you stay awake and you continue to build adenosine. Circadian rhythm does its own thing and it reaches this dip. This is that point at 3 or 4 a.m. when you feel like a zombie and you can't keep your eyes open, you feel cold. These are all features of the lowest point of your circadian rhythm. As the day goes on, as you get closer to 7 a.m., you're going into the wake phase of the circadian rhythm, which is why you feel more alert. And people are often okay during the following day, but the big crash happens that second night when you get that circadian downturn that corresponds to a super high adenosine. That this is when sleep is irresistible. This is when you have to be careful on a train because you'll end up in Plymouth or somewhere else at the end of the train. And actually, this area here, this excess of adenosine, is really excessive sleepiness. And actually, this is a very useful thing for a sleep clinic to utilize to get people falling asleep quicker and staying asleep.
So let's talk about one of the most common reasons that people start to struggle with their sleep, which is stress, anxiety, and worry. When our mind is racing at night and we're thinking about work or relationships or money or just replaying past conversations, it can then affect our sleep. But why does this happen? And it all comes down to how our brains are wired for survival. When we feel stressed or anxious, our body will activate that fight or flight response. And I'm sure you've all heard of this. It's that system that is designed to keep us alert and safe in the face of danger. And thousands of years ago, when we had things like saber-toothed tigers, that was super useful because if there was a real threat, like the predator, our brains needed to keep us awake and we were ready to respond. But if you fast forward to today, the threats have changed, but our brains react in the same way. Instead of things like the saber-toothed tiger, our stresses are more things like work stresses, like the deadlines or the volume of emails or the pressure to perform. Or we've got financial worries like the bills and the cost of living or our job security. You might have some social reasons, maybe relationships, conflicts, social media, even global events like the news and climate change. But also, naturally, you might find that we overthink at bedtime, where we're worrying about the past or the future. And often, our brain doesn't know the difference between what's real, immediate dangers and our imagined worries. So, when we're lying in bed thinking about that difficult conversation or a busy day ahead, our brain, in its way, still reacts as if you're still in danger. It floods with the adrenaline and the cortisol, keeping us in that state of alertness, even though what we actually need is to relax and sleep. But this is where things get tricky because sleep loss and stress create this vicious cycle. So sleep loss causes anxiety and anxiety causes sleep loss. When you don't sleep well, our brains become quite sensitive to stress. And you might recognize that sleep deprivation starts to amplify the limbic system, that part of your brain that controls fear, emotion, making everything more overwhelming. You only need to think back to the last time that you were sleep deprived, and you probably felt like it was difficult to make a decision, to decide what to do that day, to navigate your work life, and things became more stressful. And that's what happens is with lack of sleep, we have a state of hyperarousal, but it happens with anxiety too. Our brains become more on high alert when we're feeling anxious. With anxiety and sleep deprivation, we're often overthinking things and ruminating, worrying about not getting enough sleep and its consequences, worrying about what's going on in the day or in the past. And this increases our stress response as well. Our body will produce even more cortisol, making sleep even harder. So, sleep loss causes anxiety, and anxiety, unfortunately, also causes sleep loss. And there's that vicious cycle. And this cycle can quickly turn into insomnia, where Dr. Dave will explain more.
Thanks. So this is a chart. It was actually based on some research from the 80s, which feels like a long time ago now, but it stood the test of time just because it's such a good way of showing that transition from normal sleep through the early stages of insomnia through to something called chronic insomnia. And chronic means just the amount of time that it's been present rather than severity. So you've got 4 pillars. And in the first pillar, this is your predisposition. And then running through all these pillars is this horizontal line, your insomnia threshold. So with your predisposition, basically the key point here is that all of us are some way on our way to insomnia, but it is different for everyone. And what makes your predisposition is also quite varied. So it can be things like having a small bladder or just being a light sleeper. But it can also be things like your tendency to worry. There are certain personality types that have a high predisposition to insomnia. So perfectionists, if you have expectations of perfection, but also we live in a world that isn't perfect and you're constantly running into conflict, and this can manifest as insomnia. So basically, we're all of us some way on our way to insomnia. Now, with acute insomnia, the second pillar, you can see that something's happened that's put you over that insomnia threshold and you've stopped sleeping. That something has stressed you out, some stress, worry, or anxiety has occurred and you've stopped sleeping. And really what this represents is the saber-toothed tiger walking into your cave when you're about to fall asleep. Whereas before, sleep was controlled with those 2 systems, a circadian rhythm and the adenosine sleep drive, that this has been overruled by stress, worry, and anxiety. And we are absolutely hardwired for this to happen. And there's often there's often not so much that you can do about this. This is just how we have evolved. Now, with early insomnia, the first thing that you'll notice is this blue section. So these are your coping mechanisms. So these are things that you do during the day to help you cope with the sleep deprivation at night. So these things are also varied. So it can be things like napping or drinking lots of caffeine. Now, for most people, their insomnia will actually fizz out at this point, but not everybody's does this. And a certain number will go on to something called chronic insomnia. And the key point here is that whatever originally triggered your insomnia, that's actually reduced to below the threshold. But what keeps your insomnia alive are these coping mechanisms, are these things that you've done during the day to help you cope, but now actually perpetuate your insomnia. Now, these perpetuating factors can be picked apart. I actually mentioned a couple earlier. I mentioned napping and caffeine. Now, napping and caffeine can be relevant if you have just a bit of poor sleep. So poor sleep is never perfect. And it's actually quite common to sleep badly on a couple of nights per week, say. But insomnia is a very specific diagnosis. And actually, in the context of insomnia, it's very rare for napping or caffeine to be the problem. But what you do get is this thing called sleep effort. So this is trying hard to sleep. And it's interesting how insidious it can be, how sleep effort can enter your life and become established. And it's often in the form of well-meant advice to get you sleeping better. So things like, sleep hygiene or relaxation, breath work, yoga, chamomile tea, pillow sprays, and lavender oil, all these things. Now, it's absolutely not to say that these things can't help with your sleep. But if you approach it in a very purposeful and intentional way, that all it does is just draw all this anticipation and expectation and worry and anxiety about sleep. And so you actually end up sleeping badly. The second one to mention is this weak link between the bed and sleep. So I don't know if you've ever wondered how the body actually falls asleep, given that it's outside of our control. It's something that's so automatic that we often don't even think about it as a thing. But the way it's thought to happen is a bit like this idea of Pavlov's dog, if you've heard of the story, that this man, Pavlov, used to feed his dog at the same time each day, same time as the church bell would ring. But one day he was late coming back, and when he walked in, he saw his dog was already salivating because the dog had heard the bell, associated the bell with the food, and started salivating. And this is how it's meant to work with sleep, but it's that link with the bed, that there's a strong link between the bed meaning sleep. So this has been built up. So as babies, we're sleepy, we get put in bed. As toddlers, we're sleepy, we get put in bed. So the bed really means sleep. And you can test this. So you can ask someone who sleeps well, say, how do you sleep? And they'll go, I don't know. I just get into bed and it happens. I guarantee that's what they'll say. And some people, you'll talk about the bed and you'll see them start to yawn. But what happens in insomnia is that for whatever reason, you've stopped sleeping. So you're now spending hours in bed, awake, trying to sleep, getting annoyed that you can't sleep. The bed now means this battleground, this conflict with sleep. And this is why a lot of our patients will say, I'll fall asleep in front of the TV, no problem. But when I get into bed, for some reason, my mind just takes off and I can't stop thinking, I can't stop worrying and thinking, how am I going to function the next day if I don't sleep? Because that's what the bed has started to mean. And there's also what we know about people with insomnia is that they think an awful lot about sleep at night, but they also think a lot about sleep during the day. And if you ask them what they're thinking about, it's often not true. It's often not fair. It's things like, if I don't sleep the full amount, I will not function at all the next day. Or they'll think that their sleep will never get better, which also isn't true. So there's various thoughts, which Ellice is going to chat about a bit later, that actually help perpetuate your insomnia. So on to some just practical tips for sleeping better. So as I said earlier, poor sleep is common. So perfect sleep doesn't exist. And it's quite normal to sleep badly. Sometimes people would say 2 nights per week that you can have trouble either falling asleep or staying asleep or just not feel like you're having good quality sleep. So there is this thing called sleep hygiene, which is, it's quite an unusual term. I find it quite annoying because it doesn't really tell you anything about what it is, but this is what it's been called. So sleep hygiene is really about stacking the odds in your favor of having a better night's sleep. And so we kind of break this into 3 bits to help it be a bit more easy to understand. So one is we call scheduling, one is the preparation for sleep, and the other is the sleeping environment. So things like napping and caffeine. Napping could be a bit of a problem because if you think about it in terms of adenosine, if you oversleep during the day, that you drop your adenosine. So when you get into bed later, it can be, you can not have enough drive for sleep. So trying to avoid napping can sometimes actually help with sleep later. Caffeine, again, is actually relevant for adenosine because the way that caffeine works is it blocks adenosine. So if you've drunk a lot of caffeine, you get this temporary postponement of tiredness. So this is fantastic in the morning and in the early afternoon, but sometimes if you drink it a bit too close to bedtime, that you'll find that you can't sleep. Smoking, again, is something that promotes wakefulness. Alcohol is an interesting one because if you drink, you may know that if you've had a drink, it's easier to fall asleep. You'll fall asleep quicker in most cases, but actually you tend to get disruption and fragmentation later on in the night. So sleep isn't just about how quickly you fall asleep, it's about quality and continuity. Your pre-bed routine can be useful here. That actually, if you have some consistency in what you do, that in the same way as that Pavlov dog reaction happens and triggers sleep, that it can start this chain reaction to get you more focused on bed. But it's also important to make sure that in that pre-sleep hour or half an hour, is that you're not trying to activate your mind, that you want to do things that relax your mind. So trying to avoid things like work emails and other things that might activate your mind when you really need it to relax. And the other thing to avoid is excessive time in bed. So if you can imagine, if that's your sleep need, if you stretch it out to here, your sleep will naturally fragment. So you'll find that you either take some time to fall asleep or you'll wake up several times through the night and not be able to get back to sleep. So actually, if you compress your sleep opportunity a little bit, you find that you often sleep better, and you'll get into these deeper stages of sleep, which are generally felt to be more restorative.
So, as David has said, one of the biggest reasons sleep struggles persist isn't just the lack of sleep itself, but actually how we think about our sleep. And when we can't sleep, our minds are often jumping to unhelpful, anxiety provoking thoughts, which just make things worse, which is where thought restructuring can be really powerful. And it's a technique that is used in cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And it helps us challenge and reframe those unhelpful thoughts. So instead of seeing sleep as this rigid or thinking about it in a catastrophic way, we are learning to think about it in a more flexible and realistic way. And the goal is that we're reducing anxiety around sleep so we can naturally relax and actually improve it. And David's already mentioned some common unhelpful thoughts about sleep. And I've put some examples on how you can help reframe them. So often people think, I'll never get any sleep based on their previous history. But perhaps we can try to reframe it to say, I've managed on little sleep before. Even if tonight isn't great, I will be okay. And often people have this idea of they have to get 8 hours or they have to get a certain amount of hours. Otherwise, they'll feel awful tomorrow. But actually, that is not necessarily true. And perhaps we can start to think about it instead of I can't feel or I will feel awful tomorrow. I can function on different amounts of sleep. Some nights I will sleep less and I will still manage fine the next day. And often we have this all or nothing thinking, if I don't sleep now, my whole day will be ruined tomorrow. But actually, we might be a little tired, but we can still have productive days. So try to reframe how we think about sleep so that it can be more flexible and also realistic. Another strategy that can help with your sleep is relaxation techniques. And I'm sure many of these are already familiar with, but they are really powerful tools for calming the central nervous system, which helps us reduce how we are overthinking and improve our sleep quality. So there's three key techniques that are highly effective for sleep. The first one being progressive muscle relaxation, which is a simple technique where you tense and then release different muscle groups in the body, where you work from head to toe. So you might start with your face, your shoulders, move down to your arms, your hands, and so on. And you tense the muscles for maybe 5 to 10 seconds and then slowly release. And that will help your body feel more relaxed. Then, of course, we have breathing techniques or breath work. So anything to do with our breathing techniques can help regulate the nervous system and lower stress and encourage relaxation. And you probably know that when we feel anxious, we tend to breathe in a different way, a way that's more rapid or shallow, and that keeps our bodies in this heightened state of arousal. So if we slow our breath down, we can signal to our brain that it's time to relax. And the third technique could be mindfulness or journaling. So that is the practice of being present in the moment, a great way to offload your thoughts. And journaling can even offload your thoughts by, brain dumping or planning. And Dr. David also recommends a sleep journal where you can actually write down the thoughts that you're having and then you can actively reframe them as well. So mindfulness and journaling are also great techniques when it comes to relaxation.
So you can see how sleep is important and how it can affect so many parts of your life, including work. And so we're always very keen to try and work in these settings and try to improve how your workplace is run through sleep support. So our approach to this, so sleep health education, we think is really important because actually when you understand about how sleep is controlled and the general mechanics of this, you can see how you can get your sleep back on track, and you can just start to see more of the importance of sleep. We work a lot with shift work, so anyone who works shifts would know that sleep often takes a hit. We've seen that sleep has such an impact on our physical and mental health that that it's important to actually address this. And while perfect sleep doesn't exist at the best of times, and almost certainly doesn't exist on shifts, it's actually that you can sleep better. There are still improvements that you can make. And if you speak to someone who does shifts, they'll tell you that some days they'll sleep well and their night shift will go better, and other days they will sleep less well and their night shift will be more challenging. But what is it that makes the difference here? What are the factors at play? And usually factors that actually are under your control. So we just help you understand how to take control of these factors, how to optimize your sleep. We run assessments for workplaces to see how your workplace is sleeping, see where the challenges are. Sometimes it's through stress that can be generated from work that can disrupt your sleep, or shift work, or often it's actually other things. So 41% of the workforce are parents. And actually, if your children aren't sleeping, that can usually mean that your whole household doesn't sleep well. So actually helping your children sleep better can help your workforce sleep better. We also work with individuals. So the gold standard treatment for insomnia is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. So with that chart that showed the progression to chronic insomnia, that last section, the perpetuating factors are really built from actions and thoughts. So cognitive behavioral therapy is the gold standard treatment for insomnia, which is a talking therapy that you can do either in person or online. And there's other sort of more general well-being initiatives to help with stress and anxiety. So sleep, whenever anything's part of that fundamental pyramid of health, it's really difficult to see sleep just in isolation. It is inextricably linked to so many other parts of your life. So actually, more general well-being initiatives can really help you sleep. What we offer more specifically, so I mentioned the workplace assessments, which we do for free. So really happy to do a proper data mining exercise and really understand what's going on with the sleep in your workplace. We run live workshops with Q&A, and the most common subjects that we do is sleep health and well-being. We do sleep and shift work, sleep in the menopause. So disrupted sleep is one of the most common complaints of the menopause. And actually, if you get people sleeping better, it can make a lot of the other symptoms associated with the menopause a lot better. And we also work with jet lag. So many workplaces involve a lot of international travel. So we work in this area. So we do workshops. We also provide on-demand video resources. So big workplaces, sometimes it's difficult to get everyone together for a workshop, but on-demand content can be a way of getting around that. And then if you do have people in your workforce who are struggling with sleep disorders, things like insomnia or another condition called sleep apnea, we do work with people on that one-to-one basis. And so if you'd like any more information, then do drop us an email. So that's team@thebettersleepclinic.co.uk. And I think that's it from the presentation now, but we're really happy to take any questions.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot today and why sleep is so important. So hopefully the key takeaway has been clear. Better sleep isn't just about getting more hours, but actually creating the right conditions to rest and getting support when we need it. But are there any questions for the fantastic Dr. David or I? I can start off with one question, Dave, whilst we wait for any more. We had a comment in one of our LinkedIn posts about bringing her 4-year-old to the webinar today, and so I'm wondering what kind of support you have out there for parents and carers, or those with responsibilities, or little sleep thieves. What kind of support we have for those?
Let's have sleep thieves. All these cases are actually very individual, and so a lot of it is actually really trying to understand what's going on with an individual's sleep. There's common issues. So depending on the age of the child, sometimes it's actually discussing about expectations of sleep and actually understanding what a child's sleep pattern should be, and trying to sort of work around that to a degree. Understanding because stress actually works with children as well, that children do feel stress, and actually trying to make life easier for your child can often improve sleep. Things like nightmares can be a feature, especially when you're younger. And there's other sleep disorders which are much more common when you're a child. But often actually works in a similar way to the that chart that showed the transition from normal sleep through to chronic insomnia. But the kind of the general process is this habitualization of poor sleep, and which can happen to children. So sometimes the original reason that can disrupt your sleep isn't so important, but it's how the situation has progressed and how there's become a bit of a habit. So just trying to find ways to improve how your child actually views sleep, views bedtime, reduces anxieties over bedtimes, and it becomes more accepting of bedtimes. But there's a variety of different things that you can do.
Yeah, and individualized
Really
support is obviously best. Yeah.
absolutely, yeah. And so there is a similar sort of approach to cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia that you do with adults, but depending on the child's age, not all of these cognitive components they can engage with depending on their developmental age. But it's probably focusing more on the behavioral aspects that can influence sleep.
Fantastic. Okay, another question then. Taking magnesium seems to be on trend at the moment. So just wondering, does it help?
Good question, and it is absolutely on trend. So good things that you can take from this, that when anything about sleep is on trend, it means that people are taking sleep seriously, that they're seeing sleep really impacts my waking life and I want to sleep better. So that is great. But it is difficult to navigate all this advice that you're getting, and magnesium's thrown its hat into the ring as a possible solution. It has been researched. Most of the research doesn't really suggest there's much impact on your sleep. Those that do, actually, if you pick the study apart, hasn't been that good. What we know about healthcare and sleep is no different, is that we are all very different. We are all very much individual. And so there might be some people for whom magnesium does help, but actually on a wider scale, it isn't something that we've seen in big studies. And while there might be some improvement in your sleep with magnesium, what we know is there's definitely going to be more help with your sleep with things like CBT for insomnia. And if your sleep isn't actually insomnia, if it's more like poor sleep, that sleep hygiene is an evidence-based practice. So there are things that you can look at, but this is where there is evidence. This is probably where you should look first. But magnesium, that's fine. Don't spend too much money on supplements, but it won't do any harm.
Interesting. No, that's really helpful. Okay, and then final question. You mentioned small bladder, which some people might relate to, but hydration is often really important and it does help with our sleep as well, doesn't it? So what can we try to do to mitigate but keeping hydrated, but then also making sure we're not up 3 or 4 times in the night needing a wee?
Yeah, great question. So if you are getting up in the night and going for a pee, first reflect, think, did my bladder wake me, or did I wake up and thought, may as well go for a pee, seeing as I'm awake? Because often it's actually the second one, that if you're waking up for another reason. But if it is your bladder that's waking you up, and you have that urge to pee, and you go and you pee in like a good volume, probably is your bladder. Now, as Ellice says, hydration is really important, but you can bring your hydration earlier in the day. So while there is, you want to make sure you're getting enough fluid, that you can actually sometimes go sips from 6. So only really wetting your whistle from 6 p.m. rather than taking large volumes in. So you probably have your last big pee while you're still awake, but you won't become dehydrated overnight. So that's not a bad first port of call if you're waking up overnight.
Fantastic. And speaking of, I think I could go for a wee. So shall we wrap things up now? It was really lovely to speak about sleep with you today, and I really hope that people who attended found the session helpful. As we said, if you need individualized support or if your organization is interested in sleep and wellbeing programs, please do reach out. If you want to pop that last slide up, maybe Dave, for the email address, that would be great. And quote this webinar to discuss how we can support you with personalised strategies. And remember, there are free workplace assessments from the Sleep Clinic available to workplaces as well. So thank you all so much. I know we've run over a little bit, but I really appreciate your time. And hopefully we will see you again at the next webinar. Take care, everyone.